Hi everyone, my name is Christina and I'm an implementation consultant at Prosymmetry. This will be part 2 of reviewing the general settings tile in Tempus resource. In this video, we will be walking through the unit settings tab within general settings. The unit settings tab gives administrators options to configure critical units of measurement throughout the system. In Tempus, you can choose a dominant unit, configure default capacity values, and more. So let's get started. To get to general settings, we will go to admin settings and then this green general settings tile. And again, in this video, we will be walking through the unit settings tab. And as a note, the only tab we will not cover in this series is this resource request tab because that process and its configuration is covered in a separate video. So let's walk through the unit settings tab. The first setting is defining your dominant unit in Tempus. This should be established before allocations are made in your system because it will be the source unit of your data that all other units will be derived from. There are two main units you can choose from, time and FTE. My system's current dominant unit is FTE. If I wanted to change it to time, I would click here. When you make time your dominant unit, this means that allocations entered in time or hours will persist, and then the corresponding FTE value will be calculated by dividing the number of hours allocated by the resource's base capacity hours. So for example, if someone is allocated for 10 hours on one day, the resultant FTE value would be 1.25, assuming their base capacity is a standard 8-hour workday. When you make FTE your dominant unit like I have, this means that allocations entered in FTE will persist, and then the corresponding time or hours value will be calculated by multiplying the FTE value allocated by the resource's base capacity hours. So for example, if a resource is allocated for 0.5 FTE, the resultant time value will be 4 hours, assuming the same standard 8-hour workday. Next, you will choose which allocation unit should be the default unit in your environment. This just simply means which one is starred in your allocation grids and is therefore the first unit someone is directed to allocate in. So mine is FTE. And if I go to my allocation grid, we can see that that unit is starred and it's my dominant unit. If I chose time as my default unit, this would be starred here. Next, I will choose which of the allocation units are active in my allocation grids. So choosing which ones appear here for your users to allocate in. Next is hours per man day. So this is if you allocate in man days, you would define here how many hours equals one man day or working day. Next is where you can define how your resources' capacity values should relate to one another. The default ratio is that 1 FTE will equal 8 hours per day. However, some organizations have different ways of calculating this conversion. So for example, for organizations that maybe have a 32-hour work week, they may have a ratio of 6.4 hours per day equals 0.8 FTE. In general, we recommend planning to 1 FTE regardless of how many hours define a workday, because it's much easier to plan to a whole number. The last two settings are used to configure a resource allocation threshold option in Tempus. If you'd like to enable allocation thresholds for resources, here's where you will define which dataset the flag should appear in when a resource is allocated beyond their capacity, meaning where do you do your resource planning? And then you will define which capacity value should be considered for that threshold, whether it's base capacity or net capacity, if you're using something to offset base capacity. For more information on this process and its use cases, please visit the Help Center. So this wraps up part 2 of the general settings series on the unit settings tab. Please watch the other videos in this series as well to review the other tabs in this tile. Thanks and have a great day.